invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored paper, the kind that spoke of old money and older secrets. Charlotte Morrison stared at the elegant handwriting as rain drummed against her London flats windows. Her university friend Oliver Wellington had invited her to spend a weekend at his family's estate in the Scottish Highlands. After months of cramming for her final exams, the prospect of escaping to the countryside seemed like heaven. What she didn't know was that some doors should never be opened, and some invitations lead to places you can never leave. The Wellington estate loomed against the storm clouds like something from a Gothic nightmare. Charlotte pressed her face to the taxi window as they wound up the gravel drive, counting the darkened windows that stared back at her like hollow eyes. The mansion had stood for over 3 centuries, its stone walls bearing witness to generations of secrets. Oliver met her at the massive oak doors, his usual cheerful demeanor slightly strained. "Charlotte, so glad you made it before the storm hit." He embraced her warmly, but she noticed how his eyes kept darting to the upper floors. Come in. Let me introduce you to the others." The foyer was magnificent, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but there was something oppressive about the shadows that gathered in the corners. Charlotte met the other weekend guests: James Peterson from Toronto, a fellow history student with nervous energy and thick-rimmed glasses; Vivian Clark, a sharp-tongued art critic from Melbourne who seemed to appraise everything with calculating eyes; and finally, David Murphy from Dublin, Oliver's rugby teammate who possessed an easy laugh that echoed too loudly in the cavernous halls. As Oliver led them up the grand staircase for the room assignments, Charlotte couldn't help but notice one door that stood apart from the others. It was painted black, unlike the rich mahogany of every other door in the corridor, and bore heavy iron locks that looked centuries old. Most peculiar of all, someone had nailed wooden boards across its frame. "What's behind that door?" James asked, pushing his glasses up his nose. Oliver's cheerful mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been fear. "Oh, that old thing. Just storage, really. Family junk from generations past. Nothing interesting, I assure you." His laugh sounded forced. "Besides, we lost the keys ages ago. Completely sealed up now." But Charlotte noticed how his hands trembled as he spoke, and how quickly he ushered them past the mysterious door. That evening, as thunder crashed outside and rain lashed the windows, the 5 friends gathered in the library for drinks. The room was warm and inviting, leather-bound books lining the walls, a fire crackling merrily in the stone fireplace. Yet Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows between the shelves. "This place has quite the history," Oliver said, pouring generous glasses of wine. "Built in 1692 by my ancestor, Lord Edmund Wellington. He was an interesting man, had quite a fascination with what you might call the occult." "Spooky," Vivian laughed, but her voice carried a nervous edge. "Please tell me we're not staying in a haunted house." "Every old house has its ghost stories," David said with a grin. "Part of the charm, right?" Oliver's smile faltered again. "Well, there have been some incidents over the years. Nothing too serious. Just the occasional unexplained noise. Footsteps in empty corridors. That sort of thing." Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty mansion. "What kind of incidents?" "Oh, you know." Oliver waved his hand dismissively, but his eyes avoided theirs. "Servants quitting without notice. Guests leaving in the middle of the night. My great-aunt Victoria refused to visit after 1987. Said she heard someone calling her name from upstairs, but when she went to look, all the rooms were empty." The wind howled around the mansion like a living thing, and somewhere in the distance, they all heard it, the sound of a door creaking open and slamming shut, over and over again. "Just the wind," Oliver said quickly, but his knuckles were white around his wine glass. The old place settles strangely in storms. But Charlotte knew the sound wasn't coming from downstairs. It was coming from somewhere above them, somewhere near that locked black door. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. Vivian complained of feeling watched. James kept glancing nervously at the windows, certain he'd seen movement in the darkness outside. David's boisterous laughter became forced and hollow. When they finally retired for the night, Charlotte found herself in a bedroom directly below the sealed room. As she lay in the ornate four-poster bed, listening to the storm rage outside, she heard something that made her blood turn to ice. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth directly above her head. But that was impossible. The room upstairs was locked. Sealed. Empty. Wasn't it? The footsteps continued for hours, back and forth, accompanied by what sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Sometimes she thought she heard muffled voices, whispered conversations in a language she couldn't understand. When morning finally came, Charlotte was exhausted and on edge. At breakfast, she mentioned the sounds to Oliver. His face went pale as parchment. "You must have been dreaming," he said firmly. "That room has been sealed for over 30 years. There's no way anyone could be up there." But James had heard it too, and Vivian, and David. All 4 guests had spent the night listening to footsteps and whispers from a room that was supposed to be empty. "Look," Oliver said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I know how it sounds, but that room, it's been locked for good reason. My grandfather sealed it after." He stopped, shaking his head. "After an accident. It's not safe. The floorboards are rotted. The whole structure is unstable. That's why we keep it locked." But his explanation felt like a lie, and they all knew it. That afternoon, while Oliver was busy with estate business, the 4 friends found themselves drawn back to the black door. In daylight, it looked even more ominous. The wooden boards nailed across it were thick and sturdy, but they could see gaps between them, and through those gaps, darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe. "There's definitely something in there," James whispered, pressing his ear to one of the gaps. "I can hear movement." "This is madness," Vivian said, but she was leaning in too, trying to peer through the cracks. "Oliver's obviously lying about something." David ran his hands along the edges of the boards. "These nails are old, but not that old. Someone sealed this recently. Within the last few years, I'd say." Charlotte felt drawn to the door like a moth to flame. There was something behind it, something that wanted to be found. She could feel it calling to her, whispering her name in voices too low to hear, but impossible to ignore. "We should leave it alone," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she was examining the locks. They were massive iron things that looked medieval, but she noticed something odd. They weren't locked. The hasps hung open, held closed only by the wooden boards nailed across the frame. "The locks aren't even engaged," she said quietly. "Whatever's in there, it's not locked in. It's just contained." That night, the sounds were worse. Not just footsteps now, but scratching. Long, deliberate scratches against wood, like fingernails dragging across the floor above. And the voices were clearer, multiple voices speaking in urgent whispers that rose and fell like a tide. Charlotte lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized she could understand some of the words. They weren't speaking a foreign language after all. They were speaking English, just very, very old English. Middle English, perhaps. The kind she'd studied in her medieval literature courses. "Come up," the voices seemed to say. "Come up and see. Come up and know." She found herself standing beside her bed without remembering getting up. Her feet were bare on the cold floor, and she was moving toward the door as if pulled by invisible strings. The corridor was dark and silent except for the sounds from above. The voices were clearer now, more insistent. She could make out individual words. Sister. Daughter. Flesh. Her hand was on the doorknob before she realized what she was doing. She was about to leave her room, to go upstairs, to go to that black door. A hand grabbed her shoulder, and she nearly screamed. "Charlotte!" It was James, his face pale and frightened. "I heard you moving around. Are you all right?" She blinked, confused. How had she gotten to the door? She'd been in bed just moments before. I was going to see what's upstairs," he finished grimly. "I know. I've been fighting the urge all night. So have the others. Whatever's in that room, it's calling to us." They found Vivian and David in the corridor, both looking dazed and confused. All four of them had been drawn from their beds by the voices above. "This is wrong," Vivian whispered. "This whole place is wrong. We should leave. Right now." But even as she spoke, they all knew they couldn't. Something was holding them here. Something that needed them to stay until what? Until they opened that door? Oliver found them huddled together in the hallway at dawn. His face crumpled when he saw them, as if he'd been dreading this moment his entire life. "You can hear them too now," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "What's up there, Oliver?" Charlotte demanded. "And don't lie to us again. We deserve the truth." Oliver sank against the wall, looking older than his 22 years. "My family," he whispered. "3 generations of Wellingtons. They're all up there. All of them who've tried to open that door." The silence that followed was deafening. "What do you mean?" James asked carefully. "The room, it doesn't just contain something," Oliver said. "It takes people. My great-grandfather was the first. He was obsessed with the occult, with contacting the dead. He performed some kind of ritual in that room in 1924. When the servants found him 3 days later, he was just gone, but they could still hear his voice coming from inside." "That's impossible," Vivian said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My grandfather tried to get him out, brought in priests, investigators, even a demolition crew. But everyone who went into that room, they never came back out. Oh, their bodies were still there, but they were empty, like shells. And their voices joined the others, calling from somewhere that wasn't quite inside the room and wasn't quite outside it either." Charlotte felt sick. "How many people?" 17 over the years. Family members, servants, investigators. My Uncle Andrew was the last, in 1993. That's when we finally sealed it completely, boarded it up, and swore never to open it again." "But why didn't you tell us?" David demanded angrily. Oliver looked at him with haunted eyes. "Because it doesn't matter. Don't you understand? Just being in this house, just knowing about the room, it's already too late. It's been calling to you since the moment you arrived. And eventually, it always gets what it wants." As if summoned by his words, the voices upstairs suddenly grew louder, clearer, more insistent. "Come up," they called in their ancient English. "Come up and join us. Come up and be family." And Charlotte realized with growing horror that she recognized one of the voices. It was Oliver's Uncle Andrew, the one who'd supposedly died in 1993. But if he was dead, how was he speaking? "We have to leave," she said urgently. "Right now. All of us." But when they tried to go downstairs, they found the front door wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut. Every exit had been mysteriously blocked during the night. They were trapped. "It won't let us leave until we give it what it wants," Oliver said dully. "Someone has to go up there. Someone has to open that door. It's the only way." "No," Charlotte said firmly. "There has to be another way. There's always another way." But even as she spoke, she could feel the pull growing stronger. The voices were inside her head now, whispering directly to her thoughts, promising her things, knowledge, power, belonging. The wooden boards across the door began to creak and splinter without anyone touching them. The iron hasps swung open of their own accord. Whatever was behind that black door was done waiting. It was ready to feed. Charlotte took a step toward the stairs, then another. She couldn't help herself. The calling was too strong, too insistent. Behind her, she heard the others following, their footsteps slow and mechanical like sleepwalkers. The black door stood open now, revealing darkness so complete it seemed solid. But from within that darkness came the voices of 17 people who had entered that room over the past century and never truly left. "Welcome," they whispered as Charlotte reached for the door handle. "Welcome to the family." Her hand touched the cold iron, and she stepped forward into the darkness. The last thing she heard was Oliver's anguished cry from behind her. And then, silence. The next morning, the groundskeeper found the 5 young people seated around the breakfast table, staring at nothing with empty eyes. They were breathing, their hearts were beating, but when he spoke to them, no one answered. That night, 5 new voices joined the chorus from upstairs. and the black door stood open, waiting patiently for the next group of guests who would be drawn to its ancient hunger. After all, some doors are not meant to keep things out. They're meant to keep things in. And once you hear the calling, once you know the secret of the locked room, there's no escaping what you've become part of. The Wellington estate still stands today, though it's been empty for years. Sometimes, on stormy nights, locals claim they can hear voices coming from the upper floors. 22 voices now, calling out in languages both ancient and modern, inviting travelers to come closer, to come inside, to discover why the upstairs door was sealed shut. But those who are wise, those who value their souls, they drive past without stopping, because some invitations should never be accepted, and some doors should never be opened, even when they're calling your name. The old Victorian boarding house on Maple Street had been home to countless students over the decades. Its creaking wooden floors and drafty windows were part of its charm, or so the brochure claimed. What it failed to mention was the host who roamed its halls when darkness fell. James Morrison, a graduate student from Toronto, had been living there for 3 months when the footsteps began. At first, he dismissed them as fellow residents returning late from the library or parties. But as weeks passed, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., the same slow, deliberate steps would echo through the hallway outside his room. The sound was unmistakable, heavy boots dragging slightly across the worn carpet, accompanied by a faint whisper that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. James would press his ear to the door, but the words remained just beyond comprehension, like a conversation heard underwater. His neighbor, Charlotte Williams from Manchester, had noticed it too. She mentioned it casually one morning over coffee in the communal kitchen, her British accent trembling slightly as she described the nightly ritual. "It's probably just old pipes," she said, though her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. But pipes don't whisper names. It was Oliver Peterson from Sydney who first heard his own name carried on those midnight murmurs. He'd been cramming for finals, surviving on energy drinks and determination, when the presence stopped directly outside his door. The whispering grew clearer, more insistent. Oliver Peterson, room 17. He never spoke of what happened next, but the next morning, his parents received a call from the university. Oliver had withdrawn from all his classes and returned to Australia without explanation. His room remained empty for the rest of the semester. The truth about the host began to unravel when Isabella Rossi, an exchange student from Rome, decided to investigate. She was studying architectural history and had access to the building's records. What she discovered in the dusty archives sent chills down her spine. The boarding house had been built in 1897 by a man named Theodore Blackwood. He had served as the building's first caretaker and host, living in a small apartment in the basement. According to the records, Theodore had been obsessively protective of his residents, checking on them throughout the night to ensure their safety. But protection can become possession. The newspaper clipping Isabella found was dated October 13th, 1923. Local boarding house host found dead after week-long search. The article described how Theodore Blackwood had been discovered in the basement, having apparently died of exhaustion. Witnesses claimed he had refused to sleep for days, insisting that his guests needed constant supervision. The coroner's report, buried in the archives, revealed something even more disturbing. Theodore's body showed signs of extreme sleeplessness, extending far beyond a few days. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken, his fingernails worn down to the quick from clawing at walls and doors. Most unnervingly, his mouth was found open in a permanent whisper. Isabella shared her findings with the remaining residents, James, Charlotte, and 2 others, Henrik from Copenhagen and Marie from Brussels. They formed an unlikely alliance, united by their shared terror and determination to uncover the truth. That's when they decided to stay awake and confront the host directly. On a moonless Thursday night, they positioned themselves strategically throughout the hallway. James stationed himself near the stairs, while Charlotte crouched by the window at the far end. Henrik and Marie flanked the corridor, armed with cameras and voice recorders. At 2:17 a.m., the footsteps began. But this time, they could see him. Theodore Blackwood materialized from the shadows near the basement stairs. His form flickered like a candle flame, translucent yet undeniably present. His clothes were the same ones he'd dyed in nearly a century ago, a worn brown suit and those heavy boots that had echoed through countless nights. His face was the most horrifying aspect of all, gaunt and pale, with eyes that darted constantly from door to door, never resting. His mouth moved in an endless whisper, calling out names of residents past and present. Some were students who had lived there decades ago. Others were current occupants. But as Theodore's ghostly gaze fell upon each of them, something changed. His whispers became more agitated, more desperate. He seemed confused by their presence in the hallway, their wakeful state, disrupting his nightly ritual. "You should be sleeping." His voice finally became audible, hollow and echoing as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "It's not safe to wander at night. Return to your rooms. I must check on everyone." Charlotte found her voice first. "Theodore, you don't need to check on us anymore. We're safe." The spirit's head snapped toward her with unnatural speed. "Safe? How can you be safe if I don't watch over you? How can I rest if I don't know you're secure in your beds? I am the host. This is my responsibility." James stepped forward carefully. "You've been watching over students for 100 years. You've done your job. You can rest now." But Theodore's form began to flicker more violently. "Rest? I cannot rest. Mrs. Pemberton in room 12 hasn't returned from her evening walk. Young William in room 8 left his window open. The new girl in room 15 hasn't eaten properly in days. I must check. I must watch. I must whisper their names to ensure they're still breathing." The realization hit them all at once. Theodore wasn't just a restless spirit. He was trapped in an endless loop of obsessive care. His dedication to his residents had become a prison that death couldn't break. Marie, her French accent thick with emotion, spoke gently. "Theodore, Mrs. Pemberton died in 1952. William graduated in 1968. The students you're watching over, they're not there anymore. You're alone." The host's form began to waver more dramatically. For the first time in a century, doubt crept into his ethereal features. But I heard them. I whispered their names, and they answered. Room by room, night by night, they're all here. "You're whispering to empty rooms," Henrik said softly. "The voices you hear are echoes from the past. You've been caring for ghosts of memory." Theodore's eyes, sunken and weary, began to focus differently, as if seeing clearly for the first time since his death. He looked down the hallway and saw it as it truly was, not the bustling boarding house of his memories, but a building filled with new faces, new lives, new students who didn't need his restless vigil. "I was so tired," he whispered, his voice fading like a dying wind. "So very tired. But I couldn't sleep. They needed me to watch over them." Isabella stepped forward. "They did need you, Theodore, and you watched over them faithfully. But now it's time to let others take care of the new students. It's time for you to sleep." The host looked at each of them in turn, these living students who had shown him more compassion than fear. Slowly, his form began to fade, but not with the violent flickering of before. This time, he faded like the ending of a gentle song. "Take care of each other." His final whisper echoed through the hallway. "And remember to lock your windows." The heavy footsteps fell silent. From that night forward, the boarding house on Maple Street was peaceful. The 2:17 a.m. ritual ended, replaced by the normal sounds of students living, studying, and sleeping safely in their beds. But sometimes, just sometimes, residents report catching a glimpse of a figure in a brown suit near the basement stairs, not pacing or checking doors, but sitting quietly on the steps, finally at rest. The host who never slept had found his peace at last. Theodore Blackwood's watch had ended. Yet in room 17, Oliver's old room, students still occasionally hear the faintest whisper on particularly quiet nights. Not a call of concern or endless checking, but something different, something that sounds almost like sweet dreams. The host may finally be sleeping, but his care for the students remains, transformed from obsession into a gentle blessing that watches over their rest. And in the basement archives, Isabella left a small plaque that reads, "In memory of Theodore Blackwood, devoted host, who watched over students from 1897 to 2024. May he finally rest in peace." The whispers have stopped, but the building remembers. And sometimes, memory is the most powerful force of all. The old Victorian mansion stood against the stormy Canadian sky like a monument to forgotten nightmares. Lightning illuminated its weathered facade as David Richardson and his girlfriend Amanda Foster pulled into the gravel driveway. Their romantic weekend getaway had brought them to this remote bed and breakfast in the wilderness of British Columbia, far from the bustling streets of Vancouver. "This place gives me the creeps," Amanda whispered, clutching David's arm as they approached the towering oak doors. The wind howled through the ancient trees, creating shadows that danced like living things across the mansion's windows. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, the elderly proprietor, greeted them with a smile that seemed to hide darker secrets. Her pale blue eyes held an unsettling gleam as she led them through dimly lit corridors adorned with antique mirrors of every shape and size. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," she said, her voice echoing through the halls. "You will be staying in our finest suite, the Victorian room. It has the most spectacular views." The room was elegant, yet eerily outdated, with ornate furniture and mirrors covering nearly every wall. A massive gilded mirror dominated the space above the bed, while smaller ones reflected their images from every angle. The reflections seemed to multiply endlessly, creating an optical maze that made Amanda dizzy. "These mirrors are beautiful," David commented, running his fingers along an antique frame. "They must be over 100 years old." Mrs. Blackwood's smile widened unnaturally. "Oh yes, they've seen many guests over the decades. They hold so many memories." As the night deepened, David and Amanda settled into their romantic evening. They opened a bottle of wine by the fireplace, completely unaware of the sinister truth lurking behind the reflective surfaces surrounding them. The storm outside intensified, causing the mansion to creak and groan like a living creature in pain. Around midnight, Amanda noticed something odd. While brushing her teeth in the bathroom, she caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror that didn't match her own motions. She paused, staring at her reflection, but everything appeared normal. "David, did you see that?" she called out, but he was already asleep. The next morning brought no relief from the unsettling atmosphere. During breakfast, Mrs. Blackwood mentioned the mansion's history with disturbing enthusiasm. "This place was built by my great-grandfather in 1887, she explained, her eyes gleaming with twisted pride. He was a man of unusual interests. He believed that mirrors were windows to the soul, and he could observe the true nature of his guests through them." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of observations?" "Oh, just studying human behavior, my dear. Nothing too concerning." Mrs. Blackwood's laugh was like broken glass. "Would you like to see his old study? It's filled with his collection of viewing devices." The study was a nightmare of antique cameras, telescopes, and mirrors arranged in bizarre configurations. Dust particles danced in the pale light, streaming through grimy windows, and Amanda noticed small holes drilled through the walls at eye level. "Your great-grandfather was a photographer?" David asked, examining an old camera. "Among other things," Mrs. Blackwood replied cryptically. "He was particularly interested in intimate moments. He believed they revealed the deepest truths about people." That evening, as they prepared for bed, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every mirror seemed to contain hidden eyes, and she found herself covering them with towels. David laughed at her paranoia, but his laughter felt forced and nervous. "It's just an old house, Amanda. These Victorian places always feel spooky." But as they turned off the lights, both of them noticed something that made their blood freeze. Tiny red dots were glowing behind several of the mirrors, barely visible, but definitely there. The dots pulsed like electronic heartbeats, and they realized with growing horror that they were camera lights. "David, we need to leave." "Now," Amanda whispered, her voice trembling with terror. They began investigating the mirrors more carefully, and their worst fears were confirmed. Behind the glass were modern video cameras, some of them clearly recording. The antique frames were clever disguises for a sophisticated surveillance system that had been watching their every move. David used his phone's flashlight to examine the largest mirror above the bed. Through the glass, he could see a complex network of cameras and recording equipment. Dozens of lenses stared back at them like mechanical eyes, and red recording lights blinked in the darkness. "How long have they been watching us?" Amanda asked, her voice barely audible. Their question was answered by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Mrs. Blackwood's voice drifted through the door, but now it carried a menacing tone that made their skin crawl. "I hope you're enjoying your stay. You've been providing such entertaining footage." The door handle turned slowly, and they realized they were trapped in a nightmare that was far from over. The mirrors that surrounded them weren't just watching. They were recording everything for an audience they couldn't see, and Mrs. Blackwood was just the beginning of their terrifying ordeal. As lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white light, Amanda and David saw the truth reflected in every surface around them. They weren't guests at a romantic getaway. They were unwilling performers in someone's twisted voyeuristic fantasy, and the cameras behind the mirrors had been capturing their most private moments. The storm raged on outside Blackwood Manor, but the real tempest was just beginning inside those mirror-lined walls. And somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes continued to watch, waiting to see what would happen when their victims finally understood the full extent of their terrifying situation. The mirrors reflected their fear back at them endlessly, multiplying their horror until it filled every corner of the room. And in that moment, they realized that some reflections show more than just your image. They show your darkest nightmares coming to life. The old Victorian house stood like a forgotten memory against the stormy evening sky. Jessica had been driving for 7 hours straight from Toronto when she finally spotted the address. The Airbnb looked exactly like photos online. Perfect wooden shutters, charming front porch, and that welcoming yellow light spilling from the windows. What the photos hadn't shown was how the house seemed to watch her as she approached. Jessica pulled her suitcase from the rental car, rain beginning to the gravel driveway. She was here for her sister's wedding in the nearby town, but every hotel had been booked solid. This little cottage 20 minutes outside of town was her only option. The key was exactly where the host promised, under the third flower pot on the left. As she opened the heavy wooden door, the smell of lavender and old wood greeted her. The interior was beautifully restored. Antique furniture, soft lighting, and everything spotlessly clean. On the coffee table sat a leather-bound guest book with an elegant pen beside it. A small note in cursive handwriting read, "Please share your experience with future guests." Jessica smiled and flipped through the pages while settling into the comfortable armchair. The entries were mostly positive. Lovely decorations, amazing breakfast recommendations, perfect for a romantic getaway. But as she read further, something began to feel wrong. The most recent entry, dated just 3 days ago, was from someone named Christopher from Vancouver. Beautiful place, wonderful amenities, felt completely at home. Don't stay past midnight. Jessica frowned and flipped back a page. An entry from Emma from London. Had the most relaxing weekend here. The bed was incredibly comfortable, and the kitchen had everything we needed. Don't stay past midnight. Her hands began to tremble slightly as she continued reading. Every single entry, going back months, ended with the same chilling warning. Don't stay past midnight. Some were written in shaky handwriting, others in neat cursive, but they all contained those exact same 5 words. Jessica glanced at her phone. 9:47 p.m. She told herself it was probably some kind of inside joke among guests. Maybe the host had asked people to write it as a quirky tradition. She'd heard of stranger things on social media, but deep down, something felt terribly wrong. She decided to call the host. The phone rang, and rang before going to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached David. Leave a message and I'll get back to you soon." Jessica's voice shook as she spoke. "Hi, David. This is Jessica, your guest at the Victorian cottage tonight. I have some questions about the guest book entries. Please call me back as soon as possible. The house suddenly felt much larger and much more empty than it had moments before. Every small sound seemed amplified. The settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant rumble of thunder. She tried to distract herself by making tea in the pristine kitchen, but her eyes kept drifting to the clock on the microwave. 10:23 p.m. The entries in the guest book haunted her thoughts. Why would dozens of different people from different countries all write the exact same warning? What happened at midnight? Jessica decided to do some research. She opened her laptop and searched for the address along with terms like haunted and midnight. Nothing came up. She tried searching for the host's name and any local ghost stories. Still nothing. But then she found something that made her blood run cold. A local news article from 18 months ago. Tourist found dead at rental property. Mysterious circumstances baffle police. The article was brief, but it mentioned a young woman from Australia named Patricia who had rented this exact house. She'd been found dead in the living room at dawn, with no signs of violence or medical emergency. The coroner had ruled it a heart attack, though Patricia had no history of heart problems. The article mentioned one strange detail. Patricia's final social media post, made at 11:58 p.m., simply read, "Something's wrong. I should have listened to the guest book." Jessica's hands were shaking as she checked the time. 11:19 p.m. She began packing frantically, throwing clothes into her suitcase without folding them. She had to get out. Now, before midnight. But as she zipped up her bag, she heard something that made her freeze completely. Footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps walking back and forth across the ceiling above her head. Jessica stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding. The Airbnb listing clearly stated this was a single-story cottage. There was no upstairs. She'd checked every room when she arrived. The footsteps continued. Back and forth. Back and forth. Then they stopped and started coming down stairs that shouldn't exist. Jessica grabbed her keys and ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The lock that had worked perfectly fine an hour ago now seemed jammed. She twisted and pulled, but the door remained sealed shut. The footsteps were in the hallway now, getting closer. Jessica ran to the back door, also locked tight. The windows were old and painted shut, impossible to open quickly. She was trapped. 11:47 p.m. The footsteps stopped right outside the living room. Jessica pressed herself against the far wall, clutching her phone, but there was no signal. Of course there was no signal. The temperature in the room began to drop rapidly. Her breath came out in visible puffs as frost started forming on the windows. 11:52 p.m. A shadow appeared in the doorway. It was the shape of a person, but wrong somehow. Too tall, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. The shadow began to move toward her, and Jessica could hear a sound like whispers mixed with static, growing louder and more intense. 11:58 p.m. Jessica remembered Patricia's final post and grabbed the pen from beside the guest book. With shaking hands, she wrote, "The house is beautiful and the host was very responsive. Everything was perfect. Don't stay past midnight." The whispers stopped. The shadow paused. 11:59 p.m. Jessica closed the guest book and held her breath. The clock struck midnight with 12 heavy chimes that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shadow simply disappeared. The temperature returned to normal. The doors unlocked with soft clicks. Jessica didn't hesitate. She grabbed her suitcase and ran to her car, not looking back once. As she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw the house standing there, looking perfectly normal and welcoming once again. The yellow lights still glowed warmly in the windows. But now Jessica understood. The house let you stay. It let you enjoy your visit, experience its charm and comfort, but only until midnight. After that, you belonged to whatever lived in those walls. The next morning, Jessica's phone buzzed with a text from David, the host. "Hope you enjoyed your stay. Please don't forget to leave a review." Jessica stared at the message for a long time. Then she opened the Airbnb app and wrote her review. Beautiful historic property with amazing attention to detail. The host was very accommodating, and the location was perfect for our needs. Would definitely stay again. Don't stay past midnight. 5 stars. Because some warnings are meant to save lives, and some traditions must never be broken. The vacation rental looked perfect in the photos. Jackson Mitchell had spent weeks scrolling through countless listings before settling on this quaint Victorian house nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont. The price was almost too good to be true for such a beautiful property, but Jackson figured he'd gotten lucky. After months of grueling work at his consulting firm in Toronto, he desperately needed this solo retreat. The house stood exactly as advertised. Ivy crawled up weathered brick walls, and tall windows reflected the dying autumn light. Mrs. Patricia Holloway, the elderly owner, greeted him at the front door with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome, dear," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I do hope you'll find everything to your satisfaction." As she led him through the house, Jackson noticed how her fingers seemed to shake slightly when she pointed out various amenities. The living room was spacious and inviting, filled with antique furniture that spoke of generations past. The kitchen was modest but functional, and upstairs, 3 bedrooms weighted with crisp linens and the faint scent of lavender. "The house has been in my family for over a century," Mrs. Holloway explained as they completed the tour. "My grandfather built it himself back in 1923. Every room has its own character." Something in her tone made Jackson pause, but before he could ask what she meant, she was already heading toward the front door. "I'll leave you to settle in. Do try to get some rest, dear. And remember," she paused at the threshold, her weathered hand gripping the door frame, "some doors are meant to stay closed." With that cryptic warning, she disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving Jackson alone with nothing but the sound of wind whistling through old wooden beams. The first night passed without incident. Jackson unpacked his belongings, made himself a simple dinner, and fell asleep to the gentle creaking of an old house settling in the cool Vermont air. It was exactly the peaceful retreat he'd been craving. The second day, however, brought an unsettling discovery. While exploring the house more thoroughly in daylight, Jackson noticed something odd in the basement. What he'd initially dismissed as a shadow along the far wall revealed itself to be something far more intriguing. Running his hands along the rough stone foundation, his fingers found the unmistakable outline of a door. The surface was smooth wood, painted the same dark color as the basement walls, making it nearly invisible in the dim light. There was no handle, no obvious way to open it, just a small keyhole that seemed to stare back at him like a tiny, unblinking eye. Jackson's curiosity was immediately piqued. Why would there be a hidden door in the basement? And why hadn't Mrs. Holloway mentioned it during the tour? He spent the rest of the afternoon searching for a key, going through every drawer, every cabinet, every possible hiding place he could think of. Just as frustration was beginning to set in, his fingers found something taped to the underside of the kitchen table. A small, ornate key with strange symbols etched along its surface. His heart pounded with anticipation as he returned to the basement. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. With a soft click that seemed to echo far too loudly in the confined space, the door swung open. Beyond lay a narrow stone staircase, descending into absolute darkness. Jackson grabbed a flashlight and stepped through the threshold. The air grew noticeably colder as he descended, and each step seemed to take him further from the world above. The stairs went down much deeper than he'd expected, far below what should have been the foundation of the house. At the bottom, his flashlight beam revealed a long corridor lined with more doors. 7 doors in total, each one different from the others. Some were modern, some appeared ancient, and one looked like it belonged in a hospital. What struck him most was the complete silence. No sound from above penetrated this deep underground space. Curiosity overcoming caution, Jackson approached the first door. It was made of heavy oak with iron hinges that looked centuries old. As his hand touched the handle, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Scratching, coming from the other side of the door. He jerked his hand away and stepped back. but the scratching continued. Slow, deliberate marks being carved into wood. Then came a voice, barely a whisper, but unmistakably human. "Let me out, please. I've been here so long." Jackson's rational mind screamed at him to run, but something kept his feet planted firmly on the cold stone floor. The voice continued, growing more desperate. She promised it would only be temporary. That was in 1987. Do you know what year it is now? Please tell me what year it is. With shaking hands, Jackson called out, "It's 2024. The scratching stopped abruptly. Then came a sound that would haunt him forever. Sobbing. Deep, anguished sobs that spoke of decades of despair. 37 years, the voice whispered. She kept me here for 37 years. Against every instinct, Jackson found himself reaching for the door handle again. But before he could turn it, another voice called out from further down the corridor. Then another, and another. Soon, the underground space was filled with a chorus of desperate pleas, each voice telling a similar story. Visitors to the house above, guests who had found the hidden door, who had been curious, just like Jackson. Each one had been trapped here, in these rooms, for years or decades. "Don't trust her," called a woman's voice from behind the third door. "Patricia Holloway isn't what she seems. None of us are supposed to be here. We all came for vacation rentals, weekend getaways. We all found the door." Jackson's flashlight began to flicker, the beam growing weaker with each passing second. In the growing darkness, he could hear footsteps on the stairs behind him. Slow, measured steps that he recognized as Mrs. Holloway's distinctive gait. "I see you found my little secret," came her voice from the stairway, but it no longer carried the warm, grandmotherly tone from their first meeting. This voice was cold, calculating, with an undertone that suggested something far older and more sinister than the simple elderly woman. "What is this place?" Jackson demanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "This is where curious guests go when they can't leave well enough alone," Mrs. Holloway replied, her footsteps growing closer. "You see, dear, some visitors become so attached to my house that they simply can't bear to leave, so I make sure they don't have to." Jackson ran toward the stairs, but found his path blocked. Mrs. Holloway stood there, but she looked different now. Her elderly appearance seemed to shift and waver in the dim light, revealing glimpses of something underneath. Something that definitely wasn't human. "Each room is perfectly suited to its occupant," she continued conversationally. "Take Robert in room 3. He's been here since 1965. Still thinks it's the summer of love. And dear Margaret in room 5? She arrived in 1978 and still asks about her husband every day. They all become part of the house eventually. Part of my collection." Jackson's flashlight died completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. In that blackness, he heard the sound of another door opening. The 8th door, the one he hadn't noticed before, positioned directly across from the bottom of the stairs. "Your room is ready." Mrs. Holloway's voice seemed to come from all directions at once. "I've been preparing it since the moment you booked your stay. You see, I knew you'd be curious. They always are. The curious ones always find the door." Jackson felt hands grabbing him, but they didn't feel like the frail hands of an elderly woman. These were strong, cold, and seemed to have far too many fingers. He struggled desperately, but more hands joined the first, pulling him toward the open door of room 8. "Don't worry," Mrs. Holloway's voice whispered directly in his ear. "Time moves differently down here. The first few years are the hardest, but after that, you'll settle in nicely. They all do eventually." As Jackson was dragged across the threshold of his new prison, the last thing he heard was the sound of 7 other doors opening simultaneously. The previous occupants were being let out, not to escape, but to welcome their newest neighbor. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through his very soul. In the complete darkness of his new home, Jackson heard Mrs. Holloway's footsteps retreating up the stairs. Soon, he knew, she would be preparing for the next guest, the next curious visitor who would see that perfect listing with that too-good-to-be-true price. From somewhere in the darkness of his room, Jackson heard his own voice whisper the words he would soon be saying to the next unfortunate soul who found their way down those stone steps. "Let me out, please. I've been here so long." Above them all, the Victorian house settled back into peaceful silence, waiting patiently for its next guest. The listing was already back online, with fresh photos and glowing reviews from visitors who had supposedly stayed there and loved every minute of their time in that charming Vermont rental. But if future guests looked carefully at those reviews, they might notice something odd. Every single reviewer mentioned how quiet the house was, how peaceful, how they felt like they could stay forever. And in the basement, behind that hidden door, the collection grows larger with each passing year. Mrs. Holloway takes excellent care of her guests. After all, some visitors to her house check out, but they never really leave. The booking confirmation email arrived at exactly 3:33 a.m. Jake Morrison had been refreshing his inbox for hours, desperately searching for accommodation in the remote Scottish Highlands. Every hotel was booked solid, every bed and breakfast full. Then suddenly, there it was. A beautiful stone cottage with perfect reviews, available immediately, and priced so low it seemed almost impossible. The host's name was listed simply as previous management. No profile picture, no personal details, just 5-star ratings and glowing reviews dating back only 3 months. Something felt OFF about the whole thing, but Jake was exhausted from driving through the winding mountain roads, and the alternative was sleeping in his car. He pulled up the gravel driveway at nearly midnight. The cottage stood silhouetted against the moonless sky, its windows reflecting nothing but darkness. As Jake approached the front door, he noticed something peculiar. The porch light flickered in a strange pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again, like some kind of signal. The lockbox hung exactly where the instructions indicated. Inside, a single brass key, warm to the touch despite the bitter Highland cold. Jake turned the key, and the door swung open with a soft creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. The interior was beautiful. Rustic wooden beams, a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture that looked barely used. But there was something in the air, a scent Jake couldn't quite identify. Not unpleasant, but familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. He dropped his bags in the living room and headed upstairs to find the bedroom. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, each sound seeming to announce his presence to the empty house. At the top of the stairs, 3 doors. The first was a bathroom. The second, a linen closet. The third. Jake pushed open the bedroom door and froze. There was someone in the bed. A figure lay beneath the covers, perfectly still, the outline of a human form clearly visible under the thick comforter. Jake's heart began to pound. Had he entered the wrong house? Was this some terrible mistake? "Hello," he whispered into the darkness. No response. Jake fumbled for the light switch, his hands shaking. The overhead bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the room. He looked at the bed again, expecting to see an angry homeowner or confused guest. The bed was empty, but the sheets were still warm, still indented in the perfect shape of a human body, as if someone had been lying there just moments before and simply vanished. Jake backed toward the doorway, his mind racing. He must have imagined it. The long drive, the exhaustion, the strange atmosphere of the place. It was playing tricks on his eyes. That had to be it. He returned downstairs to check the booking details again. Maybe there was another guest. Maybe this was some kind of shared accommodation he hadn't noticed. But the listing clearly stated, entire place to yourself. Too tired to drive anywhere else, Jake decided to sleep on the living room couch. He grabbed a blanket from the linen closet and settled in, leaving all the lights on. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. Somewhere around 3 a.m., Jake was awakened by the sound of footsteps above. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the bedroom floor. The same room where he'd found the warm, empty bed. Each footfall seemed to echo through the house, methodical and purposeful. Jake sat up, every muscle in his body tense. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, from one end of the room to the other. Then they stopped. Silence. Jake waited, holding his breath. Minutes passed. Then the unmistakable sound of bed springs creaking, as if someone had just laid down. In the morning, Jake crept upstairs to investigate. The bedroom was exactly as he'd left it, except for one detail. The bed was perfectly made. Hospital corners, pillows fluffed, coverlet smooth. But there, in the center of the mattress, was the clear impression of a human body. The sheets were warm. Jake called the number listed for the host. It went straight to a disconnected message. He tried the Airbnb customer service line. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have no record of that listing," the representative said. "The booking reference you provided doesn't exist in our system." Jake pulled up the confirmation email on his phone. The screen displayed nothing but a blank page. Impossible. He tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge. The brass key turned freely in the lock, but the door remained firmly sealed. The windows were the same. They appeared to open normally, but some invisible barrier prevented him from actually leaving. That evening, Jake discovered a journal hidden in the kitchen drawer. The entries were written in different handwriting styles, different pens, different languages, but they all told the same terrifying story. Day 1. Found someone in the bedroom. Thought it was a mistake. Day 5. The footsteps are getting louder. I can hear breathing through the walls. Day 12. I understand now. The previous guest never checked out, and neither will I. Day 20. I see him sometimes, in the mirrors. He looks just like me, but his eyes are wrong. The final entry was written in Jake's own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing it. Day 1. The new guest has arrived. Time for me to move upstairs permanently. Jake stared at the page in horror. Below his own writing, new words began to appear, as if an invisible hand was writing them. "Welcome to the cottage, Jake. The previous guest is very excited to meet you. He's been waiting upstairs all day. He says you look just like him. He says you'll understand soon enough why the door won't open, why the booking disappeared, why you can never leave. The previous guest never checked out, Jake, and now neither will you. But don't worry. Tomorrow, someone new will arrive. Someone tired and desperate, looking for a place to stay. And then you'll understand your new role here. You'll be the one waiting upstairs. You'll be the one making the footsteps. You'll be the one who never checks out. The cottage always needs a previous guest, Jake. And now that guest is you." The journal burst into flames in Jake's hands, turning to ash in seconds. Upstairs, the footsteps began again. But this time, they were coming down the stairs. Jake looked at his reflection in the darkened window. For just a moment, he could swear he saw another face staring back. A face that looked exactly like his own, but with eyes that held the weight of eternal imprisonment. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Jake Morrison never checked out. But tomorrow, someone new would receive a booking confirmation. Someone desperate for a place to stay. Someone who would find a beautiful cottage with perfect reviews and an impossibly low price. The previous guest was already waiting upstairs, ready to welcome them home. The exchange program seemed like a dream come true for Jessica. A full semester at Blackwood Academy in the English countryside, staying with what appeared to be the perfect host family. The Ashworth family had welcomed international students for over 20 years, and their Victorian manor house looked like something from a fairy tale. Mrs. Catherine Ashworth greeted Jessica at the front door with a warm smile, her silver hair perfectly arranged and her eyes twinkling with kindness. "Welcome to Ashworth Manor, dear. I'd hope you'll find your stay memorable." The house was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings, antique furniture filled every room, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched from ornate frames. Jessica's room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the sprawling gardens and the dark woods beyond. "Now then," Mrs. Ashworth said, leading Jessica to the sitting room for tea. "Every household has its little rules, doesn't it? Nothing too difficult, mind you. Just traditions that have kept our family safe and happy for generations." She handed Jessica a piece of aged parchment with elegant handwriting. "The house rules of Ashworth Manor." It read at the top, Rule 1. Never enter the basement after sunset. The old heating system can be quite dangerous in the dark. Rule 2. Do not open any windows on the second floor between midnight and dawn. The night air carries strange things from the woods. Rule 3. If you hear children laughing in the halls after 10 p.m., do not investigate. Return to your room immediately and cover your ears until morning. Rule 4. The mirror in the third-floor bathroom must remain covered with the black cloth at all times. Never remove it, no matter how curious you become. Rule 5. Should you encounter anyone in the house who claims to be a member of the Ashworth family, but whom you have not been properly introduced to, do not speak to them. Alert Mrs. Ashworth immediately. Jessica read through the list, trying to hide her confusion. These are rather unusual rules, aren't they? Mrs. Ashworth's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes. Oh, my dear, old houses have old secrets. These rules have protected our guests for decades. I'd hope you'll follow them exactly. Other students who, well, let's just say curiosity can be quite deadly in a place like this. For the first week, everything seemed normal. Jessica attended classes at Blackwood Academy, made friends with other exchange students, and enjoyed Mrs. Ashworth's excellent cooking. The rules seemed silly, just the eccentricities of an old English family. But then she met Oliver, a charming boy from a nearby village who worked part-time as a gardener for the estate. Bit odd, those rules, aren't they? Oliver said one afternoon as he trimmed the hedge outside Jessica's window. I've been working here for 3 years, and I've seen some strange things. Students who broke those rules, they changed. Some disappeared entirely. What do you mean, disappeared? Jessica asked, leaning out her window. Oliver glanced around nervously. Last year, there was this girl from Germany. Greta, I think her name was. Sweet girl, but curious. She started asking too many questions about the rules. One night, I saw lights coming from the basement. The next morning, she was different. Pale, quiet, like something had been drained out of her. A week later, her family received a letter saying she decided to leave the program early. But I never saw her pack or leave. That night, Jessica couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Greta and the other students Oliver had mentioned. Around 11 p.m., she heard it for the first time, the sound of children laughing in the hallway. Following Rule 3, she pulled her blankets over her head and tried to ignore it. But the laughter seemed to come from right outside her door, light and musical, but somehow wrong. It lasted for hours, until just before dawn. The next morning, Mrs. Ashworth served breakfast with her usual sunny disposition. Sleep well, dear? Sometimes the old house can be a bit noisy at night. I heard children laughing, Jessica said carefully. Mrs. Ashworth's hand paused as she poured tea. Did you follow the rules, Jessica? Yes, I stayed in my room. Good girl. That's what keeps you safe. But Jessica's curiosity was growing stronger each day. During her second week, she noticed that the black cloth covering the third-floor bathroom mirror seemed to move on its own sometimes, as if something behind the glass was trying to push it aside. She befriended 2 other exchange students, Thomas from Canada and Claire from Australia. Both had been staying with other families in the village, but had heard rumors about Ashworth Manor. My host family won't even drive past this place after dark, Thomas told her during lunch at school. They cross themselves and mutter prayers in Welsh. Something about the Ashworth family making a bargain with something that shouldn't be bargained with. Claire leaned in closer. I did some research at the local library. The Ashworth family has been taking in guests for over a century. Not just 20 years, like Mrs. Ashworth claims. But here's the weird part. There are newspaper reports going back decades about missing persons, always young people, always last seen in this area. The reports just stopped being investigated after a few weeks. That evening, Jessica decided to test Rule 2. She waited until 12:30 a.m., then quietly opened her third-floor window. The night air was unnaturally cold, and she immediately heard something that made her blood freeze. Whispers and languages she couldn't identify, and the sound of footsteps on the gravel below, though she could see no one in the moonlight. Then she saw them, pale figures moving between the trees at the edge of the property. They seemed to glide rather than walk, and their faces were wrong. Features shifted and blurred, as if they couldn't decide what shape to take. One of them looked up at her window and smiled with too many teeth. Jessica slammed the window shut and dove back into bed, her heart pounding. Now she understood why Rule 2 existed. The next day, Mrs. Ashworth seemed to know what Jessica had done. "Curious about our neighbors, are we?" she asked over breakfast, her tone still pleasant, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I do hope you're not planning to break any more rules, dear. It would be such a shame if something happened to you." But Jessica couldn't stop herself now. The mystery was consuming her thoughts. That afternoon, she called her parents in America, but the connection was strangely distorted. Their voices sounded far away and dreamlike, as if they were speaking from another dimension. The phone lines can be quite unreliable in the countryside, Mrs. Ashworth explained when Jessica complained. Best not to worry your family with too many calls. On Friday night, Jessica made her fatal mistake. The basement door had been calling to her all week, and she finally decided to break Rule 1. She waited until Mrs. Ashworth went to bed, then crept downstairs with her phone's flashlight. The basement door was older than the rest of the house, made of blackwood with iron hinges that groaned as she opened it. Stone steps led down into absolute darkness, and the air that rose from below was thick and sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. As she descended, Jessica realized the basement was much larger than the house above could possibly contain. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to move in her flashlight beam, and the floor was made of stones that felt warm beneath her feet. At the center of the vast underground space stood an ornate mirror, taller than a person and framed in what looked like human bones. The glass reflected not Jessica's image, but scenes of the Ashworth manor from different time periods. She saw Mrs. Ashworth, looking exactly the same age, greeting different students over what appeared to be decades. Then the mirror showed her the truth. She watched in horror as previous students broke the rules, one by one. Each time they violated a rule, something was taken from them. Their reflection grew fainter. The movements became more mechanical. Their eyes lost their light. She saw Greta, the German girl, standing in this very basement as something dark and shapeless flowed from the mirror into her body, replacing whatever had made her human. The rules weren't meant to protect the students, Jessica whispered to herself. They were meant to harvest them. Very clever, dear. Jessica spun around to find Mrs. Ashworth standing at the bottom of the stairs, but this wasn't the kindly old woman from upstairs. This version was taller, her eyes completely black, and her smile revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. You see, the old families of England made certain agreements long ago. We provide fresh souls for the things that live between worlds, and in return, we receive eternal life and protection. But the souls must be given willingly, through the breaking of freely accepted rules. That's why you give students the rules, Jessica realized with growing horror. You know they'll break them. Human nature, curiosity, it's a trap. Precisely. Each rule you break weakens the barriers between your world and ours. Break enough rules, and something else can take your place while your soul feeds our masters in the mirror realm. Jessica tried to run, but found her legs wouldn't obey. Looking down, she saw that her shadow was already beginning to fade. You opened the window, dear. You came to the basement. How many rules have you broken now? 2, 3, just 1 or 2 more, and the transformation will be complete. With enormous effort, Jessica managed to pull her phone from her pocket and send a desperate message to Thomas and Claire. Don't come to the manor. Break no rules. The family is not human. Get help. Mrs. Ashworth laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, but they're already on their way, dear. I called them an hour ago, told them you'd had an accident, and were asking for them. They should be here any moment. As if summoned by her words, Jessica heard the front door open upstairs and familiar voices calling her name. Thomas. Claire. She tried to scream, but only a whisper came out. Don't come down here. But they were already descending, drawn by Mrs. Ashworth's false cries for help. "She's down here. Oh, please hurry. Something's happened to Jessica." Jessica watched in the mirror as her friends reached the basement, saw their expressions change from concern to terror as they realized what Mrs. Ashworth truly was. The mirror began to glow, and Jessica felt something cold and hungry reaching through the glass toward all three of them. "Welcome to Ashworth Manor," Mrs. Ashworth said to Thomas and Claire. "I had to hope you'll find your stay permanent." The last thing Jessica remembered was the feeling of something else sliding into her body, like a cold hand into a glove, pushing her consciousness down into a dark place where she could only watch as her body walked upstairs, sat down to tea, and began planning how to lure the next group of curious students into breaking the rules that were never meant to protect them. 3 days later, Jessica's parents received a cheerful letter explaining that she decided to extend her stay at Ashworth Manor for the entire year. The handwriting looked exactly like hers, but Oliver, the gardener, noticed that the 3 exchange students who now helped Mrs. Ashworth with her household duties never blinked anymore, and their shadows in the afternoon sun seemed hollow. And late at night, when he was locking up the garden shed, he could swear he heard muffled screaming coming from the basement, though Mrs. Ashworth insisted the old heating system just made peculiar noises. The rules still hang in every guest room at Ashworth Manor, written on aged parchment in elegant handwriting. New students arrive each semester, and Mrs. Ashworth greets them with the same warm smile and twinkling eyes. "Every household has its little rules," she always says. "Just traditions that have kept our family safe and happy for generations." And somewhere in the basement, in the dark space that's larger than physics should allow, the mirror shows new scenes of curious students, ready to break the rules that will feed the things that hunger in the spaces between worlds. Because the host's rules were never about protection. They were about selection. And the trap is always perfectly set for the next victim who thinks they're too smart to follow simple house rules. The rain hammered against the windshield as Jessica turned the key in the ignition one more time. Nothing. The engine of their rented Toyota remained stubbornly silent, leaving 4 college friends stranded on a desolate stretch of highway somewhere in rural Montana. Lightning illuminated the endless pine forest that stretched on both sides of the road, casting twisted shadows that seemed to dance in the darkness. "This is just perfect," muttered David, checking his phone for the 100th time. "No signal, dead car, and we're supposed to be at that wedding tomorrow morning." Jessica wiped the condensation from the window and peered into the storm. "Wait, do you guys see that?" Through the sheets of rain, a faint glow appeared between the trees. As they squinted through the darkness, the outline of a house became visible, warm yellow light spilling from its windows like a beacon of hope. "Thank God," whispered Olivia, gathering her jacket around her shoulders. "Maybe they can help us, or at least let us wait out this storm." The 4th member of their group, Brandon, hesitated. "Guys, I've driven this route before. There's nothing out here for miles. How is their house right there?" But desperation overruled caution. The 4 friends grabbed their bags and sprinted through the torrential rain toward the mysterious dwelling. As they approached, details became clearer. It was a beautiful Victorian house, perfectly maintained, with wraparound porches and ornate woodwork. Warm light glowed from every window, and smoke curled from the chimney despite the summer season. Jessica knocked on a heavy wooden door. Almost immediately, it swung open to reveal a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Oh my goodness, you poor things. Come in, coming out of this terrible weather," she said, ushering them inside with genuine warmth. The interior was breathtaking. Antique furniture filled spacious rooms, oil paintings adorned the walls, and the scent of fresh baked bread wafted from what must be the kitchen. Everything felt impossibly cozy and welcoming. "I'm Mrs. Patterson," the woman said, taking their wet coats. "My husband Robert and I run a small bed and breakfast here, though I must say, we don't usually get guests arriving so late in such weather." "We're so sorry to bother you," Jessica explained. "Our car broke down and we saw your lights. We were hoping maybe you could help us. or we could stay the night." "Of course, dear. We have rooms available. In fact, you're in luck. We just had a last-minute cancellation. For rooms, perfect for your group." The friends exchanged glances. After their terrible luck with the car, finally something was going their way. Mrs. Patterson showed them to their rooms on the second floor. Each was beautifully appointed with antique furniture, thick quilts, and windows that looked out over the forest. Despite their earlier anxiety, exhaustion took over, and soon all four were fast asleep. David was the first to wake. Sunlight streamed through his window, and birds chirped merrily outside. The storm had passed, leaving the world fresh and clean. He checked his phone finally. He had signal again. As he scrolled through his messages, something caught his attention. A news alert from the previous evening. Search continues for missing Montana family. The Patterson family disappeared from their home 3 months ago under mysterious circumstances. Police found no signs of struggle at their remote bed and breakfast, but the family vanished without a trace. David's blood turned to ice. He screenshot the article and immediately sent it to the group chat, then crept quietly into the hallway. The house felt different in daylight, older somehow, with wallpaper that seemed faded and furniture covered in dust. The others emerged from their rooms, phones buzzing with David's message. Olivia's face was pale as she read. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered. "We talked to Mrs. Patterson last night. She gave us dinner, remember?" But as they descended the stairs, their confidence evaporated. The dining room where they had eaten sandwiches and hot soup was now bare except for a single dusty table. The kitchen was empty, with a thick layer of dust on every surface. The fresh bread smell from the night before was replaced by the musty odor of abandonment. "Guys," Brandon's voice cracked. "Look at this." On the mantelpiece sat 4 framed photographs. The images showed a family, Mrs. Patterson, a man who must be Robert, and 2 teenage children. But these weren't professional portraits. They were candid shots, and in each one, the family looked terrified, as if they were running from something just outside the frame. Jessica noticed something else. "The guest registry," she said, pointing to an open book on a side table. "Look at the last entry." The page was filled with names and dates, but every entry was from over 3 months ago. The final signature read, "The Patterson family, permanent residents." "We need to get out of here now," David said, grabbing his bag. They rushed outside, but stopped dead in their tracks. Their rental car sat exactly where they'd left it, but it looked as though it had been sitting there for years. Rust covered the bumpers, vines grew through the broken windows, and the tires were flat and rotted. "This is impossible," Olivia breathed. "We drove that car here last night. It was fine." Brandon pulled out his phone and opened his GPS app. According to the satellite view, they were standing in the middle of an empty forest. No house, no road, no building of any kind appeared on the map. "Check the news again," Jessica said urgently. David pulled up the local news website, and his face went white. The headline made his hands shake. 4 college students reported missing. Search begins for University of Colorado students who disappeared during road trip to Montana. Their rental car was found abandoned on Highway 287, but there is no trace of the occupants. The article was dated that morning. No. Olivia started backing away from the house. "This isn't real. We're not missing. We're right here." As they watched in growing horror, the house began to change. The fresh paint peeled away like old skin, revealing rotting wood underneath. Windows that had glowed warmly the night before were now broken and dark. The wraparound porch sagged, and the chimney crumbled before their eyes. A figure appeared in one of the upstairs windows. Mrs. Patterson waved at them, but her kind face was now gaunt and hollow, her eyes dark pits in her skull. "Welcome to our permanent vacation." Her voice drifted down to them, but her lips weren't moving. "The Airbnb that doesn't exist on the map has room for everyone who finds us in the storm." More figures appeared in the windows, dozens of them, all waving, all with the same hollow eyes and skeletal grins. Guests who had checked in but never checked out. The friends ran. They crashed through the forest, branches tearing at their clothes, until they reached what should have been the highway. But there was no road, only more trees stretching endlessly in every direction. Behind them, the sound of laughter echoed through the woods. Mrs. Patterson's voice called out cheerfully, as if she were still the kind hostess from the night before. "Don't worry, dears. Checkout isn't until 11 o'clock. And besides, we've prepared such a lovely breakfast for you. Fresh bread, just like you smelled last night. We do hope you'll stay forever." The GPS on David's phone flickered back to life, showing their location as a small dot in an endless green void. No roads led in or out. No escape route appeared on the digital map. As the sun began to set again, they saw lights flickering to life through the trees. The house was calling them back, warm and welcoming once more. Their exhausted legs could barely carry them, and the promise of shelter grew more tempting with each passing hour. "Maybe," Jessica said quietly, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Mrs. Patterson seemed nice enough, and we're so tired." One by one, they stopped running. One by one, they turned back toward the lights that beckoned through the darkness. The next morning, 4 new photos appeared on the mantelpiece of the house that didn't exist on the map. 4 college friends, smiling and waving, but with terror frozen forever in their eyes. And somewhere, another car full of travelers was pulling over in a storm, seeing lights through the trees, walking toward their very own permanent vacation at the Airbnb where checkout time never comes. The Patterson family had been missing for 3 months, but they were never really gone. They were just waiting for new guests to join their eternal hospitality business, where every visitor becomes part of the family, and every family becomes part of the house that GPS can never quite locate on any map. The old Victorian mansion stood like a wounded giant against the storm clouds, its windows staring down at the small group of college students who had just pulled up in their rental car. What they didn't know was that this weekend getaway would become the most terrifying experience of their lives. "Are you sure this is the right place?" asked Jessica, a blonde exchange student from Toronto, as she stepped out onto the gravel driveway. The wind howled through the bare branches of ancient oak trees, creating shadows that danced across the mansion's weathered facade. "According to the booking confirmation, this is it," replied David, a tall Australian student studying abroad. He pulled his jacket tighter as a particularly strong gust of wind nearly knocked him off balance. Thornfield Manor, built in 1847. The third member of their group, Charlotte from Manchester, emerged from the back seat, carrying her weekend bag. "Well, it certainly looks authentic," she said, trying to mask the unease in her voice. "Very Gothic." As they approached the heavy wooden door, it creaked open before anyone could knock. An elderly man with piercing gray eyes stood in the doorway, his gaunt frame silhouetted against the dim light from within. "You must be the students," he said in a voice that sounded like gravel scraping against stone. "I'm Bartholomew, the caretaker. Come in, come in. The storm is getting worse." The interior of the mansion was even more imposing than the outside. A grand staircase curved upward into shadows, while oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors glared down from the walls. The air smelled of old wood, dust, and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. "Your room's on the 2nd floor," Bartholomew said, leading them up the creaking stairs. "The blue room for the young lady," he gestured to Charlotte, "and the twin room at the end of the hall for you too." As they climbed higher, Jessica noticed something odd about one of the doors they passed. Unlike the others, this one had multiple heavy locks running down its length, and the wood around the handle was scarred and splintered, as if something had been clawing at it from the inside. "What's behind that door?" she asked, pointing. Bartholomew's face darkened. "That room is not for guests. It has been sealed for good reason." His voice carried a warning that made all 3 students exchange worried glances. Under no circumstances should you attempt to open it. After settling into their rooms, the 3 friends gathered in the main sitting room downstairs. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, but it did little to warm the chill that seemed to permeate the old house. Did anyone else notice how the caretaker avoided looking at that locked door? Charlotte whispered, glancing toward the staircase. David nodded. And did you see his hands? They were shaking when he mentioned it. As the evening wore on, they tried to distract themselves with card games and ghost stories, but their attention kept drifting to the ceiling above, where occasional creaking sounds echoed through the old floorboards. Around midnight, Charlotte excused herself to go to bed. "This place is giving me the creeps," she admitted. "I just want to get some sleep and leave first thing in the morning." Jessica and David stayed up a bit longer, but eventually they too retired to their room at the end of the hall. As they brushed their teeth in the small adjoining bathroom, they could hear Charlotte moving around in her room next door. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. "She must have fallen asleep quickly," Jessica whispered to David as they climbed into their respective beds. But at 2:47 a.m., Jessica woke to a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the unmistakable screech of rusted hinges, followed by footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, dragging footsteps that seemed to pause outside their door. She shook David awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. David sat up, his eyes wide in the darkness. The footsteps continued, moving slowly down the hall toward Charlotte's room. Then they heard something that made both of them freeze with terror. Charlotte's voice. But it wasn't coming from her room. It was coming from somewhere else entirely, somewhere above them. "Help me!" Charlotte's voice echoed faintly through the walls. "Please, somebody help me." Jessica and David crept to their door and pressed their ears against it. The hallway was silent now, but they could still hear Charlotte's distant pleas. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the locked door they had seen earlier. "We have to help her," Jessica whispered, but David grabbed her arm. "What if it's not really her?" he whispered back. "What if something is mimicking her voice?" That's when they heard the locks. One by one, the heavy metal bolts that secured the mysterious door were sliding open with loud, echoing clanks. The sound reverberated through the entire mansion like a death knell. Then came silence, a silence so complete and absolute that it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Jessica couldn't stand it anymore. Despite David's protests, she slowly opened their door and peered into the hallway. The locked door stood wide open now, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. "Charlotte," she called softly, "are you in there?" No response. David joined her in the doorway, and together they crept toward the open room. As they got closer, a putrid smell hit them, the stench of decay and something far worse. "We should get the caretaker," David whispered, but Jessica was already at the threshold of the room. What she saw inside made her stumble backward with a scream that echoed through the mansion. The room was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, but that wasn't what had terrified her. It was what was sitting in the corner, a figure in a tattered white dress, its head bent at an impossible angle, its long black hair hanging like a curtain over its face. And it was holding Charlotte's phone, the screen glowing with a text message that read, "Help me." The figure slowly raised its head, revealing a face that was both familiar and horrifyingly wrong. It was Charlotte, but her skin was gray and mottled, her eyes were completely black, and her mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin that showed far too many teeth. "I've been waiting," Charlotte said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Waiting so long for someone to open the door." David grabbed Jessica's hand and they ran, their footsteps pounding on the wooden floors as they raced toward the main staircase. Behind them, they could hear Charlotte, or whatever was wearing Charlotte's face, following with that same dragging gait they had heard earlier. They burst through the front door and into the storm, not stopping until they reached their car. As David fumbled with the keys, Jessica looked back at the mansion and saw Charlotte standing in an upstairs window, waving goodbye with movements that were too fluid, too boneless to be human. They drove through the night without stopping, and it wasn't until they reached the safety of the nearest town that they dared to call the police. But when the authorities investigated Thornfield Manor the next day, they found it empty. No caretaker named Bartholomew, no sign of Charlotte, and most disturbing of all, no locked room on the second floor. The only evidence of their terrifying night was a single text message on Jessica's phone, sent from Charlotte's number at 3:15 a.m. "Thank you for letting me out. I'll visit you both soon." Charlotte was never seen again, though both Jessica and David reported strange occurrences in the following months. Doors opening on their own, footsteps in empty hallways, and sometimes, late at night, they would receive text messages from Charlotte's number, always with the same message: "I'm coming home." The local historians later revealed that Thornfield Manor had been abandoned for over 50 years, ever since a young woman named Charlotte Whitmore had mysteriously disappeared from the very room that had been locked away. The room where something hungry and patient had been waiting all those years for someone foolish enough to set it free. And now, that something was loose in the world, wearing the face of an innocent college student, hunting for new victims to add to its eternal collection. The moral of the story: some doors are locked for a reason, and some things should never be allowed to escape. The acceptance letter to Blackwood Academy arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with dark wax that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Victoria Thompson held the envelope with trembling fingers, reading the elegant script that welcomed her to one of Europe's most prestigious boarding schools. "This is your chance, darling," her mother whispered, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "The education there is unmatched." Victoria packed her belongings that same afternoon. The train to Blackwood Academy wound through misty valleys and ancient forests, carrying 17 students from across the globe. There was Alexander from Canada, his hockey gear stowed beneath weathered seats. Isabella from Australia chatted nervously with twins David and Daniel from Manchester. The American students, James and Christine, kept to themselves, while Francois from France seemed oddly excited about their destination. But it was the silence that struck Victoria first. As the train approached Blackwood Academy, conversations died mid-sentence. Even the twins stopped their constant chatter. The ancient building loomed before them like a Gothic nightmare, its towers piercing the gray sky like accusing fingers. Headmaster Whitmore stood at the entrance, his smile too wide, his eyes too knowing. "Welcome, welcome," he declared, his voice carrying an unusual echo in the courtyard. "You are now part of the Blackwood family." The word family seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Victoria's room was on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. Her roommate, Catherine from Wales, had already claimed the bed by the window. "Been waiting for ages," Catherine said, but her voice sounded hollow, distant. "The walls here, they have quite the personality." That first night, Victoria lay in her narrow bed, listening to the buildings settle around her. Blackwood Academy was old, built in 1847, and old buildings made noise. Creaking floorboards, settling foundations, whined through ancient window panes. Normal sounds, except for the whispers. They started around midnight, soft at first, like conversations in adjacent rooms. Victoria pressed her ear to the wall, trying to make out words, but the sounds remained frustratingly unclear. When she asked Catherine about it the next morning, her roommate's response chilled her blood. "Oh, you hear him too now," Catherine said, brushing her teeth with mechanical precision. "The host always welcomes new students personally." Classes at Blackwood Academy were unlike anything Victoria had experienced. Literature with Professor Ashworth felt more like seances than discussions of classic texts. Mathematics with Dr. Morrison involved equations that seemed to twist reality itself. But it was history with Mrs. Blackthorne that truly unsettled her. "This academy," Mrs. Blackthorne explained on Victoria's second day, "was built on very special ground. The previous structure burned in 1846, taking with it the entire Pemberton family. All 7 members died in their sleep, unable to escape the flames that consumed their ancestral home." Isabella raised her hand. "What does that have to do with our curriculum?" Mrs. Blackthorne's smile was razor-thin. "Because, young Miss Crawford, the Pemberton family never truly left. They simply became our most dedicated residents." That evening, Victoria noticed changes in her fellow students. Alexander, who had been vibrant and talkative on the train, now moved with zombie-like compliance. The twins spoke in perfect unison, finishing each other's sentences with unnatural precision. Francois had developed a habit of staring at walls for hours, nodding as if listening to unheard conversations. "What's happening to everyone?" Victoria asked Catherine that night. Catherine was sitting rigidly on her bed, facing the wall. "The host is teaching us to be proper guests," she replied without turning around. "Soon, you'll understand too. The voice makes everything so much clearer." The voice came to Victoria on her 5th night at Blackwood Academy. She awoke at 3:17 a.m. to find herself sitting upright in bed, though she had no memory of moving. The whispers in the walls had grown louder, more insistent, and suddenly they became crystal clear. "Victoria Thompson." The voice spoke through the very foundations of the building. It was neither male nor female, neither old nor young. It simply was. "You have been chosen to serve." Her mouth opened to respond, but the voice continued before she could speak. "Tomorrow at precisely 2:30 p.m., you will go to the basement archives. You will retrieve the leather journal from shelf 17. You will bring it to room 237 in the North Tower. You will not question these instructions. You will not resist. You will comply." Victoria tried to move, tried to speak, tried to wake Catherine, but her body would not obey. She could only sit and listen as the host continued its instructions, each word boring deeper into her mind like a parasite seeking a home. "Good students follow directions, Victoria. Exceptional students become part of something far greater than themselves." The next day passed in a haze. Victoria attended classes, ate meals, participated in discussions, but it felt like watching someone else live her life. At exactly 2:29 p.m., she found herself walking toward the basement archives, though she had no conscious memory of deciding to do so. The basement of Blackwood Academy smelled of mold, old paper, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant. The archive stretched into darkness, row upon row of shelves containing books, documents, and artifacts that seemed to predate the academy itself. Shelf 17 stood in the deepest corner, shrouded in shadow. The leather journal waited there, as if it had been expecting her. The moment Victoria's fingers touched the worn cover, images flooded her mind. Fire, screaming, a family trapped in their burning home, calling out for help that never came. But beneath the terror, she sensed something else. Satisfaction. The fire hadn't been an accident. The Pemberton family thought they could contain us. The host whispered through the walls. They built barriers, spoke prayers, tried to keep us trapped in the foundation stones. But death freed us from their feeble restraints. Victoria's legs moved without her permission, carrying her up 3 flights of stairs to the North Tower. Room 237 was unlocked, waiting. Inside, she found the other students gathered in a perfect circle. Alexander, Isabella, the twins David and Daniel, James, Christine, Francois, and a dozen others she recognized from classes. All of them sat motionless, eyes fixed on the center of the room, where an old gramophone played silent music. "Place the journal in the center," the host commanded, and Victoria's arms obeyed without hesitation. As soon as the leather journal touched the floor, the gramophone began to emit sounds. Not music, but voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking in perfect harmony. "Welcome, Victoria Thompson," they said in unison. "Welcome to the eternal classroom." The journal's pages began turning of their own accord, revealing handwritten entries in faded ink. Victoria found herself reading aloud, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. Day 137 of containment. The spirits grow more restless. Father believes the iron circles will hold them, but I fear we have only delayed the inevitable. Day 208. The whispers have begun. Mother no longer sleeps. Neither do I. Day 301. They speak to us now, offering knowledge, promising enlightenment. Father burns sage and speaks prayers, but I begin to wonder, what if we are the ones who are wrong? As Victoria read, the other students began to sway in rhythm with the voices. Their eyes rolled back, showing only white, but their mouths moved in perfect synchronization with the gramophone's ghostly chorus. The Pemberton family kept us prisoner for 364 days, the host explained, its voice now coming from every student's mouth simultaneously. But on the final day, young William Pemberton made a choice. He chose knowledge over ignorance. He chose truth over comfort. The journal's pages continued turning, revealing the final entries in increasingly frantic handwriting. Day 364. I understand now. They are not evil. They are teachers. They offer lessons that no living instructor can provide. Father calls it damnation, but I call it graduation. Victoria felt her own voice joining the chorus, though she fought against it with every fiber of her being. What happened to William? William became our first host, the collective voice replied. He opened the doors. He welcomed the flames. He freed us from flesh and bone so that we might teach forever. The gramophone began spinning faster, and the voices grew more insistent. Victoria realized with growing horror that she could feel her own thoughts being pushed aside, replaced by something ancient and hungry. You have a choice, Victoria Thompson, the host whispered through her own lips. Resist and become like poor Catherine, a hollow vessel serving without understanding. Or embrace the lesson and become a host yourself, helping us guide the next generation of students. But Victoria Thompson had not survived 17 years of life by surrendering when things became difficult. As the ghostly voices pressed against her mind, she found strength in a single, burning thought: refusal. No, she whispered, then louder, no. The word seemed to echo through room 237 like a bell tolling. The other students' synchronized swaying faltered. The gramophone's needles skipped across the record with a harsh screech. Impossible, the host hissed, its voice fragmenting across multiple throats. You cannot resist the lesson. I can learn without becoming a prisoner, Victoria declared, surprising herself with her own courage. I can grow without losing myself. She grabbed the leather journal and hurled it against the wall. The binding exploded on impact, scattering pages like autumn leaves. With each scattered page, the gramophone's volume decreased, and the student's swaying slowed. The contract is binding, the host shrieked, but its voice sounded more distant now, less certain. William Pemberton opened the door. The door cannot be closed. Maybe not, Victoria admitted, helping Isabella to her feet as the Australian girl blinked in confusion. But I can choose not to walk through it. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. Victoria did not fight the host so much, she simply refused to surrender to it. Each time the ghostly voices pressed against her thoughts, she pushed back with memories of her own choosing, her mother's laughter, her father's bedtime stories, the feeling of rain on her face during a summer storm. The other students began to wake from their trance-like state, one by one. Alexander shook his head as if clearing fog. The twins began speaking independently again, their words overlapping in natural confusion rather than supernatural harmony. What happened? James asked, his American accent thick with bewilderment. We were being recruited, Victoria explained, gathering the scattered journal pages. But the recruitment is optional. The host's voice came one final time, weaker now but still filled with ancient fury. You cannot save them all, Victoria Thompson. Each night, the lessons will resume. Each morning, fewer will remember to resist. Victoria looked around at her fellow students, seeing the fear and confusion in their eyes. But she also saw something else, determination. Then we'll take turns remembering, she said simply. We'll help each other stay awake. Blackwood Academy did not change overnight. The building remained old and full of whispers. Professor Ashworth still conducted literature classes that felt like seances. Mrs. Blackthorne continued teaching history that seemed to blur the line between past and present. But the students changed. Victoria organized study groups that met in the library every evening, ostensibly to work on assignments, but actually to keep each other grounded in reality. They developed signals, code words, ways to recognize when someone was falling under the host's influence. Alexander started a hockey club, focusing on physical activity to keep their bodies and minds sharp. Isabella began a journal of her own, documenting the strange occurrences and developing strategies for resistance. "The thing about ghosts," Francois observed during one of their evening meetings, "is that they're stuck. They can't grow, can't change, can't learn anything new. But we can." Catherine, Victoria's roommate, remained the most affected. She still spent hours staring at walls, still responded to conversations no one else could hear. But occasionally, usually in the early morning hours, she would return to herself. "It's like being underwater," she explained during one of these lucid moments. "I can see the surface. I can remember what it's like to breathe, but I can't quite reach it." "Then we'll throw you a rope," Victoria promised. Victoria Thompson graduated from Blackwood Academy 3 years later, along with most of her fellow travelers from that first train ride. Alexander went on to play professional hockey in Toronto. Isabella became a marine biologist, studying in the Great Barrier Reef. The twins opened a bookshop in London that specialized in supernatural literature, but strictly as fiction. Not everyone made it through unchanged. Some students, like Catherine, remained partially lost to the host's influence, moving through life like sleepwalkers. Others transferred to different schools, unable to resist the nightly lessons. But Victoria and her core group of resistors maintained contact long after graduation. They shared a bond forged in supernatural fire, an understanding that some battles are worth fighting even when victory is not guaranteed. On quiet nights, Victoria still heard whispers in the walls of whatever building she occupied. The host, it seemed, was not limited to Blackwood Academy, but she had learned something crucial during her time there. The voice could only control those who chose to listen. And Victoria Thompson had far more interesting things to hear. The acceptance letter to Oxford University arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with ordinary wax that reflected light, like it was supposed to. Victoria opened it with steady fingers, reading the standard congratulations and enrollment details. No whispers, no ancient voices, no supernatural hosts promising forbidden knowledge. Just the normal, beautiful silence of a choice freely made. But sometimes, late at night, when the world grew quiet, Victoria would press her ear to the wall and whisper back to whatever darkness might be listening. "I'm still here. I'm still choosing. And I'm still saying, you know." The whispers never responded. They didn't need to. Victoria had learned the most important lesson of all. Some invitations are meant to be declined.